The gallery had fallen silent. Every camera turned, and Priscilla stood frozen, her face pale under the museum lights. The velvet curtain had just been pulled back. Behind it was something she never signed off on, something she had fought to keep private. Now it stood before her, larger than life, framed under glass for strangers to gawk at. For a heartbeat, she couldn't breathe. It wasn't just an exhibit. To her, it was a betrayal. But what exactly had they revealed, and why did it cut so deep? This wasn't the first time Priscilla had been. From the moment she entered this world as a young teenager in Germany, her life had been shaped by secrets, choices made for her, and truths that weren't always hers to share. For decades, she had fought to protect his image, sometimes against tabloids, sometimes against family, sometimes even against the myth of himself. Yet now, standing in that museum, she realized something horrifying. History was slipping out of her hands. For the first time, it wasn't her decision what the world saw of, it was theirs. And what they had chosen to show would ignite a storm that still hasn't settled. But to understand why this exhibit shook Priscilla to her core, we need to go back to the years when she discovered that guarding's legacy was more than a duty, it was survival. Because what happened in that museum wasn't an accident. It was the inevitable result of decades of buried truths, broken promises, and battles over who really owns the story of the king. And the deeper we dig, the more one question becomes impossible to ignore. When the world wants the truth, does love have the right to keep it hidden? Priscilla had always lived with a paradox. To millions, she was the woman who loved, the girl plucked from obscurity, swept into, and forever tied to the most famous man in the world. But behind closed doors, she often felt like something else entirely, the gatekeeper of a legacy too fragile to survive without her. After his death in 1977, Priscilla had been just 32 years old, with a daughter to raise and a mansion that felt more like a shrine than a home, was bleeding money, and the estate was nearly bankrupt. Most widows would have folded, but Priscilla didn't. She turns home into a living museum, a place where fans could grieve, celebrate, and worship. Against all odds, she transformed a financial disaster into a global empire. And yet, every decision came with a knife's edge. What should be shared? What should stay private? Which parts of story belonged to the world, and which belonged only to those who loved him? That tension followed her for decades. She knew fans adored, but she also knew they wanted more than music. They wanted access to his soul, his flaws, his heartbreak, and sometimes they wanted things Priscilla had sworn she'd never give. But here's the catch: museums and curators didn't always agree. They believed was no longer just a man, he was history, and history, they argued, belongs to everyone. This conflict simmered for years, and on that night in the museum, when Priscilla saw the exhibit unveiled, it boiled over. What did they reveal? The weeks leading up to the event had been filled with tension. The museum had promised a groundbreaking new exhibit, unseen. The promotion teased never-before-released, personal letters, and hidden truths that would change the way the world remembers the king. To fans, it sounded thrilling. To Priscilla, it sounded dangerous. She had asked questions: what exactly would be shown, who approved the materials? The answers she got were vague, carefully worded, and always ending with the same assurance: "Don't worry, Priscilla, you'll love it." But Priscilla didn't trust reassurance. She lived too long in orbit to believe in comforting words. She knew how quickly admiration could turn into exploitation. She had seen betrayed by managers, hangers-on, even supposed friends who sold their stories for cash. She had spent years correcting false headlines, burying cruel, and shielding Lisa from the parts of her father's downfall. And now she had that sinking feeling again, the sense that something was being taken from her. Who betrayed her trust this time? The opening night of the exhibit was a spectacle. Journalists lined the red carpet. Fans pressed against velvet ropes, clutching memorabilia, shouting his name as though he might walk out of the shadows. The museum director gave a glowing speech about preserving history. Priscilla smiled for the cameras, but her hands shook when she clutched her purse. She wasn't nervous about crowds. She had been facing them since she was a teenager. No, she was nervous because of what she didn't know. When the curtain was pulled back, the room went still. The first revealed was not a guitar, not a jumpsuit, not even one of handwritten lyrics. It was something far more personal, something Priscilla had sworn would never be put on display. And as the flashes went off, she whispered under her breath, "They had no right." To the crowd, it looked like a revelation. To Priscilla, it felt like theft. Because what the museum had chosen to show wasn't just history, it was hers. The crowd clapped, the director grinned, and Priscilla stood there, her mind racing, knowing that her warnings had been ignored, perhaps even by someone close to her. And that's where the real story begins. Because the question that haunted her wasn't only, what will the world think of? It was something darker. Who let this happen? And as the reporters rushed forward, as microphones were thrust toward her, one thought cut through the chaos like a blade. If she didn't fight back now, its legacy and her own place within it would never belong to her again. The first gasp in the crowd had barely faded when Priscilla realized what the museum had done. Behind the glass wasn't a guitar, a suit, or a gold record. It was a collection of handwritten notes, the kind he scribbled at night when the world wasn't watching. Some were song fragments, others were confessions, and one, in particular, contained words Priscilla had sworn no one outside the family would ever see. Her stomach dropped because she recognized the handwriting instantly. She had read those words before, late at night when had left scraps of paper on the bedside table. They weren't just lyrics, they were at his most fragile. And now they were public property. That's when the questions started hammering in her head. Who had given these pages to the museum? How had they gotten out of archives? And why, after everything she'd done to protect dignity, was she being forced to watch strangers analyze his pain under fluorescent lights? The director was smiling for the cameras, reporters scribbled notes, fans whispered to one another. But all Priscilla could hear was the echo of his voice, years earlier, when he had looked at her across a quiet room and said, "Don't let them turn me into something I'm not." She thought she had kept that promise, until now. The director's speech grew bolder. He called the letters a rare glimpse into the inner world of the king. He said they shed light on his struggles and added depth to the myth. Priscilla heard none of it. What she heard instead were the headlines forming in her mind. Darkest secrets exposed, handwritten confessions revealed. And buried in those papers was one particular note she dreaded the world discovering. It wasn't about music or even fame. It was about her. That night, when the crowd had thinned and the flashbulbs had stopped, Priscilla slipped away from the reporters and cornered a young curator in the hallway. Her voice was low, controlled, but filled with fire. "Where did you get those pages?" The curator stammered. "They were donated. We were told they had clearance." "By who?" she pressed. The young man avoided her eyes. I think it came through the family archive. Someone signed off. It wasn't me." Priscilla felt the floor tilt beneath her. Someone close had betrayed her. For years she had fought off vultures who wanted to profit from his name, but this was different. This was someone inside the circle, someone who had access. And as she replayed the curator's words, "Someone signed off," another memory surfaced. Lisa, her daughter. Just weeks earlier, they had argued about how much of truth should be revealed. Lisa had said, "People deserve to know Dad as he really was, not just the stage costume, not just the movies, the man." Priscilla had snapped back, "No, they deserve the music, the rest belongs to us." Could Lisa have been the one? The thought stabbed deeper than anything the museum could display. A daughter she loved, but who had always lived under the shadow of a father she barely knew. Was this her way of reclaiming him? Priscilla didn't want to believe it, but the seed of doubt had been planted and it wouldn't stop growing. The next day, newspapers ran wild. One letter in particular made headlines, a late-night scribble where had written, Some days I feel like I'm losing everything, the music, the love, even myself. Fans were shocked, critics debated, psychologists weighed in. Was this proof had foreseen his own downfall? To Priscilla, it wasn't analysis. It was intrusion. Those were words had written in the privacy of his own home, never meant for cameras, never meant for strangers. And yet here they were, dissected, monetized, and turned into spectacle. That evening, Priscilla sat alone in her hotel room, the headlines spread across the bed. She thought about the world remembered, the swaggering showman, the boy with the crooked grin, the man who made women faint with a single hip shake. And then she thought about the she had known, sleepless, restless, haunted by doubts, the man who sometimes whispered fears into her ear that no one else would ever hear. Now the world had a piece of that private man, and if this exhibit continued, they would take more. 2 days later, Priscilla returned to the museum. This time, she wasn't playing the part of smiling guest. She went straight to the director's office. The director, a polished man in a tailored suit, welcomed her with forced warmth. Priscilla, the exhibit has been a triumph. Visitors are lining up, press coverage is through the roof. It's exactly what deserves. She cut him off. What deserves, she said coldly, is dignity, and what you're doing is stripping it away. The director leaned back, sighing, "You've always wanted to control the narrative, but belongs to history now. History doesn't need permission." The words strung like acid. History doesn't need permission. Priscilla stood. History may not need permission, but it does need truth, and you're playing with half-truths, ripped out of context, turning pain into entertainment. The director's smile never faltered. Context doesn't sell tickets, myth does. That night, Priscilla couldn't sleep. She kept hearing those words, myth sells. Wasn't that the same logic Colonel Parker had used decades earlier, pushing into deals that nearly destroyed him? Wasn't that the same excuse the tabloids used when they printed lies? And now even museums, institutions that claimed to history, were using it too. But the deepest wound hadn't healed. Who gave them access? In the days that followed, Priscilla dug for answers. Whispers pointed to someone inside the estate. A signature had been filed. A quiet transfer of documents had been made. And then came the revelation that shook her more than the letters themselves. The signature didn't match hers. It didn't match Lisa's either. It belonged to someone else entirely, someone Priscilla hadn't thought about in years. The name scrawled on the papers was from an old associate of a man who had worked behind the scenes during the chaotic years. A man who had once been close enough to the family to slip into the archives unnoticed. Priscilla stared at the name, her pulse racing. He was supposed to be gone from their lives. Instead, he had resurfaced, and with him, old wounds that had never fully healed. Now the mystery wasn't just about stolen documents. It was about betrayal reaching back decades. For the first time, Priscilla realized this wasn't just about an exhibit. It was about control, about who owned story and who had the power to profit from it. And if she didn't uncover the full truth soon, she feared the next revelation would be even more devastating. Because the letters were just the beginning, the museum had hinted at never-before-seen photos. And if those were what she thought they might be, the damage could be permanent. Priscilla closed the file, her hands trembling. She thought she had seen the worst. But deep down, she knew the exhibit was about to reveal something far more dangerous than words on a page. Something that could not only shatter's image, but fracture the family forever. The name on the paperwork burned into Priscilla's mind. It was Lisa. It wasn't anyone from the immediate family. It was someone she thought had vanished decades ago, an old associate of Inner Circle, a man who had once held keys to back rooms. She hadn't spoken his name in years, and now here it was, tied to the betrayal unfolding before her eyes. But the signature was only the beginning, because what the museum unveiled next made the letters look tame. When the curtain lifted on the second half of the exhibit, the crowd leaned forward in awe. Flashbulbs, Gasps rippled. Priscilla's breath caught. Behind the glass was a series of never-before-seen photographs. Black and white, candid, raw, not the polished in his gold suit, not the stage idol with perfect hair and camera-ready smiles. These were private snapshots, exhausted after shows, his face hollow in the mirror, bottles of pills scattered on the counter beside him. One even showed him asleep on a sofa his shirt wrinkled, his expression haunted. To the fans, it looked like intimacy. To Priscilla, it felt like exploitation. She had seen those photos before. She knew exactly when they were taken, the late 60s, when was caught between fadding movie roles and a desperate comeback. He had been fragile then, balancing fame with fear, success with self-doubt. Those images had been locked away for a reason, not because she wanted to erase the truth, but because had always hated being seen in weakness. He wanted the world to remember the king, not the man behind the crown. And now here he was stripped bare, displayed like a specimen. Priscilla clenched her fists. Someone had gone into the archives, dug out the darkest corners, and sold them to history. The fallout was immediate. Fans split into factions. Some praised the museum for finally showing the real. Others accused it of betrayal, of turning pain into spectacle. Priscilla, standing amid the chatter, felt torn in half. She wanted to protect dignity, but another part of her wondered, was this the man the world needed to see? Because in those photos, stripped of glamour, looked human, and humanity was something the myth had stolen from him long ago. That night, Priscilla confronted the museum director again. Her voice trembled, but not with fear, with fury. "You had no right to show those pictures." The director didn't flinch. "Priscilla, the world deserves honesty. They worshipped him like a god. Don't you think they have a right to know he was human?" She shot back, "There's a difference between truth and cruelty." The director leaned closer. "Or maybe the cruelty is in pretending he was perfect. Isn't that what destroyed him in the end? The pressure to always be larger than life." The words cut deep, because they weren't entirely wrong. Later, alone in her hotel room, Priscilla replayed the conversation. She remembered her own complaints, how the world expected him to be flawless, how the mask grew every year. Once, during a quiet night in Palm Springs, he had muttered, "I'm tired of being, I just want to be me." And now, decades later, here was the world demanding to see that hidden me. But at what cost? The headlines grew louder. Talk shows debated whether Priscilla was censoring truth. Columnists painted her as controlling, unwilling to let go. And then came the second blow. A journalist uncovered that the old associate who had signed off on the materials wasn't just acting alone. He had been paid handsomely by a private collector who claimed to own more of private archives. That meant the letters and photos were only the beginning. There was more, much more. Priscilla felt the walls closing in. Every secret she had kept, every boundary she had drawn, was now under siege. She tried reaching out to Lisa again. Their phone call was tense, jagged with years of mother-daughter friction. "Did you know about this?" Priscilla demanded. "No," Lisa said, her voice sharp, "but maybe it's for the best. Maybe people should finally see what Dad went through." Priscilla's chest tightened. "At the cost of his dignity, at the cost of our family's peace." Lisa's silence spoke louder than words. That silence drove Priscilla back into the past, back to those nights when his voice cracked with loneliness, when pills lined his nightstand, when he leaned on her because there was no one else to hold him together. She had lived that pain, she had carried it, and now strangers were dissecting it like a curiosity on display. The weight of it all pressed down until she realized something chilling. If she didn't stop this, would no longer belong to the man she loved or to the family he left behind. He would belong entirely to the world, a myth rebuilt on fragments of suffering. The next week, the museum announced the next phase of the exhibit, unreleased audio recordings. Priscilla froze when she heard the news, because she knew what that meant. There were tapes, conversations had recorded privately, venting frustrations about friends, managers, even family. They weren't meant for public ears. If those surfaced, the fallout wouldn't just scar his image. It could tear apart the family itself. And Priscilla had no idea how to stop it. She called an emergency meeting with the estate lawyers, but the law was murky. If the collector had bought the materials legally, the museum had every right to display them. Priscilla slammed her hand on the table. Legal or not, this isn't right, deserves better than this circus. One lawyer muttered, then you'll have to fight it in the court of public opinion. Public opinion, the very battlefield she had spent decades trying to control. That night, as she sat in her suite surrounded by old photographs of smiling, laughing, playing with Lisa as a child, she whispered to herself, I promised I'd protect you, but maybe I can't anymore. Tears blurred her vision, because for the first time in years, she felt powerless. And yet, deep inside, something stirred, a fire that hadn't gone out. She had been underestimated before. They thought she couldn't save. They thought she couldn't manage the estate. They thought she couldn't survive without him. She had proved them wrong every time. And maybe, just maybe, she could prove them wrong again. But when the first leaked audio clip surfaced, a scratchy tape of confessing a fear no one had ever heard him admit, Priscilla realized the fight wasn't just about legacy anymore. It was about truth, and once the world heard those words, nothing could ever be taken back. The tape hissed, and then, through the static, his voice broke the silence. I'm afraid that when the music stops, there won't be anything left of me. The words hung heavy, raw, trembling with a fear few had ever heard him admit. The room full of journalists went quiet. For Priscilla, listening from across the country, it was like being punched in the chest. This was the man she had loved, the man she had tried to protect. And now his private doubts were spilling into the world, unguarded, unfiltered, unstoppable. The release of that first clip set off an earthquake. Fans wept, critics dissected every syllable, radio shows played the tape on repeat, asking, had known his end was coming, was he confessing to an emptiness no stage could ever fill? But the reaction wasn't just grief, it was division. Some praised the museum for unveiling the real, others accused them of desecration, of profiting off vulnerability. And in the middle of it all stood Priscilla, torn between silence and fury. Because if the world thought that tape was shocking, she knew there were more. And one, in particular, contained words that could rewrite everything. Behind the scenes, Priscilla scrambled. She met with lawyers, pleaded with journalists, even reached out to museum donors, hoping to apply pressure. But everywhere she turned, the answer was the same, wasn't just hers anymore. He belonged to history. She hated that phrase, belongs to history. It stripped him of his humanity, his complexity, his flaws. It turned a man into a monument, and now that monument was cracking under the weight of his own secrets. Then came the revelation that twisted the knife. Amongst personal papers, the same archive that had leaked the letters and photographs was a document few had ever seen, a draft will. It wasn't legally binding, unfinished, scribbled in scrawl, but buried in its margins were notes about how he wanted to be remembered. And the words contradicted everything Priscilla had fought for. He had written, "Don't hide me, let them know the good and the bad. Maybe they'll understand me better that way." Priscilla stared at the copy, her hands shaking. For decades, she had built walls to protect him, and now here were his own words begging for transparency. News of the draft leaked quickly. The press pounced, framing Priscilla as the gatekeeper who ignored wishes. Fans debated fiercely online. Was she protecting him or silencing him? The attacks grew personal. One headline sneered, "Priscilla doesn't own the king." Another accused her of rewriting history to protect her own image. Priscilla felt trapped. For years she had been the guardian, the one who held story together. Now she was being painted as the villain. And yet, deep inside, a sliver of doubt gnawed at her. What if they were right? What if, by shielding him, she had denied the world the chance to truly understand him? The controversy reached a fever pitch when the museum prepared to unveil the next tape. Priscilla them to reconsider. She argued with curators, with lawyers, with family, but the train had left the station. On opening night, the exhibit room was packed. Journalists crowded around, recorders ready. The director gave his polished speech about truth and humanity. And then the tape rolled. This time's voice was quieter, more intimate, almost like a confession whispered in the dark. I know they love me, but sometimes I think they love what I pretend to be, and I don't know if anyone really loves me, the man under it all. The crowd gasped, some cried, some looked away. Priscilla closed her eyes, because she remembered that night. She remembered him saying those very words, not to a microphone, but to her, and now the world had stolen that moment. The fallout was immediate. Talk shows screamed, fans argued online. Was confessing loneliness? Was he accusing the world of betrayal? Or was it simply the late-night rambling of a tired man? But amid the noise, something unexpected happened. Younger fans, those who hadn't lived through Prime, connected with him in a new way. They didn't see a myth. They saw a man wrestling with fame, with identity, with the same questions of love and authenticity that plague every generation. For the first time in decades, felt alive to them, not as a golden statue, but as a beating heart. And that terrified Priscilla even more, because she realized the truth she had tried to bury might be the very thing that kept him relevant. The weeks that followed blurred into a storm. Documentaries were rushed into production. Articles flooded the press. Fans debated not only his legacy, but Priscilla's role in shaping it. And through it all, she kept returning to one memory, the museum unveiling, the curtain lifting, that first moment when she saw what they had done. It had felt like betrayal then, but now she wondered if it was destiny. Because had once told her, half joking, half serious, one day they'll dig up everything I ever did, and maybe that's the only way they'll really know me. She hadn't believed him until now. But the final twist came months later. While reviewing archives with estate staff, Priscilla uncovered something no one else had noticed. A sealed envelope tucked inside a book of gospel hymns had loved. Inside was a handwritten note, dated just months before his death. It read, "To you'll know what to do, don't let them make me a saint, don't let them make me a villain, just let them know I tried." Priscilla sat in silence, tears spilling. For years she had tried to protect him from myth, from truth, and here, in his own words, he had given her a simple request: balance. Not perfect, not destroyed, just human. And suddenly she understood. The fight wasn't about control. It wasn't about hiding or revealing. It was about reminding the world that was both a king and a man. So here's the question. If you had been in Priscilla's place, standing in that museum, watching private fears turned into public history, what would you have done? Would you have fought to shield him, or let the world see everything, no matter the cost? Tell me in the comments, because the truth is, story isn't finished. It's still being written, and now it's in our hands.